Here's the thing, you see all these builders on Instagram use crazy blocks and their builds look super cool, but when you try it, it doesn't look as good. You'd think it's just skill, but it's actually not. The real secret is this one trick pro Minecraft builders know that literally allows them to build with any block they want. So what's the trick? Well, it's color. You might think I'm crazy if I tell you that these two blocks have the same color, but look at it from far and they start to look pretty similar. In art, they call this atmospheric perspective, and it's just a complicated word to explain that when things are far away, they look more blurry and you can't really see all the small details. Another example is if we look at this color field, it kind of just looks like a rainbow. You can't really spot specific blocks. So now you know that, but if you don't want your builds to look like this, then you need to understand scale. Sure, from far, emerald ore and copper looks the same, but if your build is small and you're supposed to look at it from close, then using these blocks is just gonna look weird. You might have heard the word block vomit online, and it's a word people use to describe exactly this: a small build with way too many different blocks. So if you don't want your builds to look like this, then you need to understand scale. Basically, the bigger your build is, the more blocks you should use. So if your build is small, use less blocks, and if your build is huge, you should be using a lot of blocks. But of course, there's a few exceptions. If your build is supposed to be seen from far, then you should use a lot of blocks and be dramatic with it. But if it's in a forest and you don't really see it unless you're up close, then use less blocks. It's a little confusing, so here's a trick to figure out how many blocks you should actually use. First, decide where you want the build to be. Then after that, you should decide from where you want to see the build most often. This is basically a picture frame. Think about it like if you were going to take a screenshot of the build, where would you take it from? After that, use a block like cobblestone and check if you can see all the small cracks and details in the block. If you don't see any detail, then that means you're far enough away to use a lot of blocks. And if you see a lot of details, then you probably shouldn't be using that many. Now you know how many blocks to use, but you need to know exactly how to use these blocks to actually make them look good. And we're going to do that with gradients. So let's start simple. A gradient is making a smooth transition from one color to another. You can do this by finding midtones, which are just transition colors to go from one side to another. In this case, I'm keeping in mind how the block will look like from far. If you have trouble finding midtones, then you can use the color wheel. Draw a line from your first color to the last, then follow that line to get all your midtones. Or if you're lazy, use a website like HueBlocks, which gives you the perfect gradient every single time. I actually prefer to use the color field in Axiom, which is a building mod, but HueBlocks is a little more simple to understand. So that's how you make a simple gradient, but of course there's a lot more ways to make a gradient. For example, you can make a gradient going up and down, and you can also go diagonally and just place your main blocks in each corner. If you want, you can even control the shape of your gradient. For example, I can make my gradient square shape, but there's not enough space to use all my blocks at the bottom. So instead, we're gonna skip some and I'll go straight to my darker blocks, while the other side is gonna be a lot more smooth of a gradient. This way I can make sure my gradient stays a square because it transitions way faster in this corner. You can also do this with any kind of shape. Like in this example, I'm making a tier shape by controlling how fast my gradient transitions in each direction. This is super useful because if you want to make a gradient on a sphere, for example, you can transition faster on the sides to make it look like light is hitting a specific spot on the shape. This makes it look like there's shadows and highlights, and we'll talk about all of that soon. But that's all simple, because what if you want to make a gradient with 3 or even 4 colors? Well, now it's a little more complicated. You still use your midtones, but you have to merge all the colors in the middle. I know it looks complicated, but it's the same technique used to make a gradient between 2 colors. I'm just using a lot more midtones to help transition every single color smoothly. And this is exactly how these builds are made. They just use a lot of gradients to mix all kinds of colors together. You can even go into a bit of color theory and make your gradients based on saturation. Basically, you go from the block with the most amount of color to the one with the least amount of color. In our terms, this is called saturation. If we use red, for example, I can find a block that has the most saturated red and slowly get rid of that color, ending up on gray. This way, all I'm doing is making a gradient between a very saturated red to a very desaturated red. So you're never actually changing colors, you're just changing the saturation. And this can be used to make some really cool effects. But in general, this is exactly how pro builders can literally pick any single block and make it look good. Just by knowing how different blocks work together, you can make a gradient with literally any single block you want. However, there are a few issues, and if you can learn this, you'll be better than most builders out there because only a few know this trick. So eventually, you'll find some colors that don't really have any midtones. There's only so many blocks in Minecraft, so instead, you have to create those colors. You can do this by using a trick called dithering. This is a trick people use in pixel art, and basically when you don't have the color you need, you can create this checkerboard pattern and your brain automatically mixes the two colors. It's as simple as making the same checkerboard pattern, and from far it looks pretty smooth. It's almost like if you're taking two different colors of paint and mixing them together. The only issue is that it can look bad on some smaller builds. You need a lot of space for it to look good, so instead of dithering, we can use glass. I'm sure by this point we've all seen those fog effects with glass, and while you can actually do something pretty similar for for gradients. If I take colored glass and overlay it on a gradient, I can basically smooth out all the rough parts. Of course, glass panes are a little more subtle, so you might prefer using those, but what's cool with glass blocks is you can actually overlay them. When you use glass like this, you can literally make any color you want, so if you can't find the right block, you can just use glass and make that color. This build by Snarple is actually a perfect example. He uses glass to make the wood look old, and it almost smooths out the transition between all the blocks he's using. Of course, there's a lot of different ways to use gradients in your builds. The obvious one is to mix colors. For example, if you want to make a colorful build like this, then you can just use a gradient to blend all the colors together. You can also use gradients to add texture. Similar to how Snarple used glass to make the wood look old, you can do the exact same thing to make your build look old or even overgrown. And then you can also use gradients to create light and shadows. Let's say this is my build. I'm gonna use a frog light to represent the sun, and now I can imagine where the light would be hitting the build. That's exactly where I'm gonna add my lighter blocks. And I'm gonna do the exact same thing where there would be shadows. Now you just make a gradient between your shadows and your highlights, and from a distance, it looks great. You can even use your shadows to create depth. Let's say that I don't want this roof to stick out a full block, but I still want it to look like it's overhanging a little bit. Well, if I use some darker blocks to show some shadows, now it looks like there's actually an overhang, but really there's nothing there. But this applies to everything. For example, if I put a lantern here, then it would probably light up the walls a little bit. So let's add some lighter blocks, and now it looks like there's actually light coming from the lantern. Finally, in my opinion, the best way to use gradients is in terrain. You can make rocks look round by shading around the rock following the shape. You can make cracks in the terrain like this, and maybe the coolest, you can add color to your terrain. Because in real life, rocks aren't always gray, so this makes them look a lot more realistic. This was a lot of information, but let's try to apply it to a build, so I can show you the difference it makes between a build that doesn't use gradients and one that does. Okay, so I'm gonna use this for inspiration, mainly for all the different colors. So I started by building out the terrain, and then I realized that it was gonna be way too small, so then I decided to build the structure first and build a terrain around it. I'm just blocking out the general shape I want the build to have, and then I use the Axiom rock tool for the terrain. I'm basically just trying to follow the general shape of my inspiration. Quick note here, if you want to work on color in your builds, I recommend looking at oil paintings. Just like this one, you can tell there's a bunch of different colors of paint, and it's gonna force you to use weird blocks to build in Minecraft, and I just think it's a great way to practice. But with the terrain done, it's as simple as applying every technique in this video to get a similar result to the painting. This takes a lot of time, to be honest. For example, it took me just shy of 4 hours to build all of this. So with that being said, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe. Anyway, when you're adding color to your build, try to step back a lot to see how the blocks work with each other from far, and that's just gonna help you see the general picture you're trying to create. But this is how the build turned out, and I think it looks pretty cool. So this is exactly how builders like BOO, fWhip, Snarple, and so many more can use any block they want to build. Just by using gradients and the tricks I showed you in this video, you can take any block in the game and make it look beautiful. When Minecraft drops a new update, I want to use the new blocks, and this is the reason I can. And now you can too. Resin is such a bright and honestly ugly block. I wanted to use it because it's new, but I couldn't because it's just so different. But now with these tricks, I can actually use it in my builds and make it look beautiful. And that's exactly how pro Minecraft builders can make ugly blocks look so good in their builds. With that, have a great rest of your day.